What if the power went out tonight? Not tomorrow, not next week. Tonight. The lights are off, the refrigerator is silent, your family is sitting in the kitchen and they're looking at you, waiting. And you walk over to your pantry, open the door, and you see it. Shelves full of food, bags of rice, cans stacked to the top, a few boxes of pasta, and for 1 second you feel relieved. But then the first question hits you. How long will this actually last? And then the second one, the one that's much harder to answer. Can I actually cook any of this right now? Here's the truth that most prepping videos won't tell you. A pantry that looks full and a pantry that actually works in a real crisis are two completely different things. Most people stock shelves to feel safe. Smart preppers stock shelves to function. When the water is limited, the fuel is running low, the kids are tired and hungry, and calm is the one thing in shortest supply. In this video, you're going to learn about 12 pantry items that most people completely overlook, items that fill the real gaps that rice and beans alone will never fix. We're talking about the fat gap, the flavor gap, the speed gap, and something nobody talks about, the morale gap. And a few of these are going to genuinely surprise you. So stay with us until the end, because the last category is honestly the one that makes everything else work. Welcome to Food Decider, where we help you eat smarter, not just stock more. If that sounds like something you need in your life, hit subscribe right now and let's get into it. Let's start at the worst possible moment. It's been 2 hours since the power went out. The house is unsettled, the kids are asking questions you don't have answers to. Everyone is hungry, and you need to put something on the table, or at least in a bowl, within the next 30 minutes. This is the moment your pantry either proves itself or fails you completely. And this is exactly where most preppers run into their first big problem. They reach for the dry beans. Now, dry beans are not a bad food. In fact, for long-term survival situations, they're one of the most valuable things you can store. They last for years, they're packed with protein and fiber, and they're incredibly affordable. But here's what nobody tells you when they're selling you on the idea of stocking up on dry beans. In the first hours of a real disruption, a bag of dry beans is completely useless. Think about what it actually takes to cook dry beans from scratch. You need to soak them overnight, then you need to boil them for anywhere between 1 and 3 hours depending on the type. That means you're burning through a significant amount of your fuel supply just to get one ingredient ready. You're using large amounts of water at a time when water might already be limited. And you're spending hours waiting for food that nobody can eat yet. In the first 72 hours of a crisis, time and fuel are two of your most precious resources. Burning both of them on beans that take all day to prepare is not a strategy, it's a liability. So what do you do instead? This is where canned beans become one of the most underrated items in the entire pantry. Not as a replacement for dry beans, smart preppers keep both, but as what you might call the first layer of your food system, the layer that activates immediately, before conditions are stable enough for long-term cooking. Canned beans are already fully cooked. They require no soaking, no extended boiling, and if necessary, no heat at all. You can open a can and eat the contents cold. You can add them to a pot with whatever liquid you have available and have a meal in 15 minutes. You can mix them with canned fish, stir them into a thin broth, or mash them with a little oil and eat them on crackers. They are the bridge between the moment the power goes out and the moment you're stable enough to start using your longer-term dry goods. But canned beans alone won't solve everything, because there's another dry good that deserves a permanent spot on your shelf, and most people don't think to buy it until they've actually been stuck without it. Red lentils. Unlike pinto beans or kidney beans or chickpeas, red lentils don't need to be soaked. They are small and soft enough that they cook in 20 to 30 minutes without any pre-soaking at all. That might not sound revolutionary, but in a situation where every cup of fuel matters, the difference between a 30-minute cook time and a 3-hour cook time is enormous. Red lentils sit in that perfect middle ground. They have the long shelf life of a dry good, but they behave almost like a fast food when you're cooking under pressure. They can be turned into a thick, filling soup. They can be cooked down into a savory porridge. They blend easily with whatever vegetables or seasoning you have available, and they thicken up beautifully, making a small amount of food feel like a complete, satisfying meal. Now, while we're talking about foods that require no prep time at all, there's one item that deserves its own moment because it is without question one of the most efficient foods you can store: peanut butter. There will be moments in a disruption, and they happen more often than people expect, when you simply do not want to turn on the stove. Maybe you're trying to conserve fuel. Maybe you're dealing with something else and you can't give the kitchen your full attention. Maybe it's late at night and you need to put something in someone's hands quickly. In those moments, peanut butter is a lifesaver. It requires zero cooking. It requires zero water. It requires almost no preparation. A few spoonfuls on crackers or bread is a complete snack with real fat and protein behind it. Stirred into a bowl of oats, it adds both richness and staying power. Eaten directly from a spoon when nothing else is ready, it buys you time without burning a single resource. The one thing to keep in mind with peanut butter is rotation. Choose the brands your family already eats and make sure you're cycling through them regularly. Peanut butter that has been sitting untouched for too long will separate and eventually go rancid, and a jar that nobody will eat is not actually part of your food supply. So at this point, you have a first layer that works. You can feed your family quickly, without burning through your fuel, without waiting hours for food to cook, and without dipping into your long-term reserves before the situation has even stabilized. But fast food is only part of the problem, because once the first 72 hours pass and you start settling into a longer disruption, a completely different issue starts to emerge, and it's one that most preppers don't see coming until it's already affecting their household. Take a look at the most common prepper pantry: rice, pasta, oats, crackers, flour, maybe some canned vegetables, a few boxes of cereal. At a glance, it looks solid. It looks like a pantry that could sustain a family for weeks. But here's what happens after 3 or 4 days of eating primarily from that pantry. People start feeling unsatisfied even after eating full meals. They feel a kind of low-grade hunger that doesn't go away. Energy drops, mood drops, and the meals start to feel like punishment rather than nourishment. The reason is almost always the same, and it's a gap that most standard preps completely fail to address: fat. Under normal conditions, we consume fat constantly without thinking about it. Butter on bread, milk in coffee, oil in cooking, cheese on everything, fatty cuts of meat at dinner. Fat is the nutrient that makes food feel satisfying, gives us sustained energy, and helps our bodies actually absorb a lot of the vitamins and minerals we need. Without it, a meal can be technically complete and still leave you feeling hollow. In a disruption, fresh meat disappears quickly. Butter goes bad without refrigeration. Milk is gone within the first day. And suddenly, a pantry full of grains and legumes, all of which are extremely low in fat, becomes a recipe for a household that is technically fed but genuinely struggling. This is where canned fish packed in oil becomes one of the most important items on your entire shelf. Sardines, mackerel, tuna packed in olive oil. These are not glamorous foods. For some people, they're an acquired taste. But in terms of nutritional value and practical function inside a crisis pantry, they are almost impossible to replace. They deliver complete protein and a meaningful amount of healthy fat in a single small can. They require no cooking whatsoever. They are shelf-stable for years. And when you add them to other foods, stirred into rice, mixed into a simple bean stew, broken up over crackers, the oil they're packed in transforms the entire dish. It soaks into dry grains. It adds richness and flavor to food that would otherwise be flat and dry. It makes a bowl of plain white rice feel like a real meal instead of a survival ration. If your pantry doesn't currently have canned fish and oil, that is one of the most meaningful gaps you can close today. But fat isn't the only thing that makes meals feel complete. There's a texture problem too, and it's one that affects people who might not even be able to articulate what's wrong with the food they're eating. Standard non-fat milk powder solves one problem. It gives you something to put in coffee or cereal, but it doesn't solve the deeper issue, which is that without dairy fat, meals feel thin. Oats cooked in water taste like something you eat because you have to. A basic porridge made with non-fat powder is technically nutritious, but emotionally empty, and that matters more than most people expect when a family is already under stress. Whole milk powder is a different product entirely. It has a richness and a depth that non-fat powder simply cannot replicate because the fat is still in it. A bowl of oats made with whole milk powder and a little honey doesn't taste like emergency rations. It tastes like breakfast.
For children especially, who are often the most resistant to eating unfamiliar or unpleasant food during a stressful situation, the difference between a meal that feels normal and one that doesn't is enormous. Whole milk powder is how you keep the people at your table actually eating, even when conditions are hard. Now let's talk about the item on this list that is perhaps the most underestimated in terms of sheer versatility: rolled oats. Most people think of oats as a breakfast food, and specifically as a sweet breakfast food. The instant flavored packets that most households keep in the cabinet are fine for a regular Tuesday morning, but they are a significant liability in a real pantry because they are locked into a single use: sweet morning.
Breakfast, that's it. Rolled oats are a completely different kind of ingredient. They can go sweet or savory depending on what you add to them, which means they can serve as a base for multiple meals throughout the day. In the morning, cooked with whole milk powder and a little dried fruit or peanut butter, they're a filling and comforting breakfast. In the evening, cooked with bouillon, red lentils, and whatever canned vegetables you have on hand, they become a thick and satisfying savory porridge that bears no resemblance whatsoever to the bowl of oatmeal you had that morning. Beyond that, rolled oats act as a thickener. If your soups and stews are coming out too thin, which happens frequently when you're cooking with limited ingredients, a handful of rolled oats stirred in will thicken the whole pot and stretch your ingredients further. They increase the volume of what you're serving without adding significant cost or complexity. For a pantry that needs to feed multiple people for an extended period, that kind of flexibility is invaluable. At this point, your pantry has a first layer for immediate use and a nutritional foundation that can sustain your household over time. But there's a third problem, and it's one that will quietly undermine everything else you've built if you don't address it directly. Imagine your household is on day 5 of a disruption. The immediate panic has passed. You have food, you have water, you have a plan, but something else has started to happen, and it's harder to name than hunger or thirst. The meals have become unbearable. Not because they're unsafe, not because there isn't enough of them, but because every single meal for the past 5 days has tasted exactly the same. Heavy, salty, starchy, flat, repetitive, and the family, especially the children, has started pushing food around in the bowl instead of eating it. People are eating less than they need, not because there isn't food available, but because they simply cannot face another bowl of the same thing. This is what survival experts call palate fatigue, and it is one of the most underestimated threats to a functional household during a prolonged disruption. When people stop eating enough because the food has become psychologically unbearable, morale deteriorates, energy drops, decision-making suffers, and the whole household becomes harder to manage. A pantry that is full of food but that nobody wants to eat has functionally failed. The fix is not expensive, it's not complicated, but it requires thinking about flavor, acidity, and variety as genuine survival tools rather than luxuries. The single most impactful item you can add to your pantry for flavor is bouillon powder. Bouillon is the backbone of a functional crisis kitchen. It is cheap, incredibly shelf-stable, and takes up almost no space. But what it does to the quality of your meals is remarkable. A pinch of bouillon stirred into a pot of rice changes the entire character of the dish. It turns plain boiled water into a warm, comforting broth that you can drink on its own or use as a base for any number of simple meals. It gives beans a depth of flavor that makes them feel intentional rather than last resort. It makes oats savory in a way that genuinely surprises people who have never tried it. The simple rule for bouillon is this: if a meal tastes flat, bouillon fixes it, and in a pantry where variety is limited, having the ability to change the flavor profile of your staples without changing the ingredients is one of the most powerful tools you have. But even bouillon used repeatedly starts to feel monotonous after a while, which is why you need something that does something completely different to food, something that wakes it up rather than just deepening it. Apple cider vinegar. This is one of those items that people almost never think to include in their emergency pantry, and it is almost always the item that experienced preppers say they are most grateful for having. The reason is simple.
Almost everything in a standard crisis pantry is heavy. Beans are heavy, rice is heavy, starchy, salty, and fat-rich foods pile up on the palate and in the stomach, and after several days, the body starts to reject them, not because they're harmful, but because there's no balance. Acidity is that balance. A small splash of apple cider vinegar in a bowl of beans cuts through the heaviness and makes the flavors pop. Added to a thin stew, it gives the dish a brightness that makes it feel more like real cooking. Stirred into a soup, it lifts everything up and makes the meal feel lighter and more palatable. You don't need much. A teaspoon or two is often enough to transform an entire pot. And because it's shelf-stable and comes in large bottles, a single purchase can cover dozens and dozens of meals. Alongside apple cider vinegar, there's another ingredient that most American preppers overlook because it isn't part of their everyday cooking, and that's dried mushrooms. Dried mushrooms bring something to a meal that is very hard to get from canned goods alone, and that is umami, that deep, savory, almost meaty quality that makes food feel genuinely satisfying rather than just filling. A small handful of dried mushrooms added to a pot of rice or a simple broth changes the entire character of the dish. It turns plain boiled water into a warm, comforting broth that you can drink on its own or use as a base for any number of simple meals. It gives beans a depth of flavor that makes them feel intentional rather than last resort. It makes oats savory in a way that genuinely surprises people who have never tried it.
And because the flavor is so concentrated, you don't need a lot. A single bag of dried mushrooms can elevate the quality of dozens of meals, making it one of the highest return pantry investments you can make per gram of storage space. Now we've covered flavor and richness, but there's one more dimension of the morale problem that goes beyond taste, and that's texture and psychological comfort. When every meal is soft, mushy, or liquid, which is what happens when you're cooking primarily from grains and legumes with limited fuel, the eating experience starts to feel oppressive. The body craves variety in texture just as much as it craves variety in flavor, and the absence of that variety is surprisingly demoralizing. Baking soda is a small, inexpensive item that most preppers don't think to include, but it quietly expands your options in important ways. If you have flour or oats, baking soda gives you the ability to make simple flatbreads, quick biscuits, or other baked goods that have a completely different texture from your usual boiled or simmered meals. That shift from something soft and wet to something dry and structured can do more for morale than you'd expect. As a bonus, baking soda can be added to certain beans during cooking to help them soften faster, which saves fuel. One important note, keep a dedicated, unopened box of baking soda for your emergency supply. The box sitting in your refrigerator absorbing odors should never be counted as part of your food storage. And finally, there is one more item that belongs in your pantry, not because it is nutritionally dense and not because it solves a cooking problem. It belongs there because of what it does to the atmosphere of a household under stress. Whole popcorn kernels. In the middle of a prolonged disruption, snacks are not a trivial thing. They serve a psychological function that is hard to overstate. When everything feels uncertain and heavy and serious, the smell of something familiar popping in a pot, the sound of it, the ritual of it, does something to the mood in a room that no bowl of beans ever could. It feels normal. It feels like something enjoyable rather than something endured. Unlike microwave popcorn, which is completely useless the moment the power goes out, whole kernels can be popped in a covered pot over any heat source, a camp stove, a gas burner, a small fire. A single cup of kernels produces a large bowl of popcorn that can occupy a family for an evening, ease the tension in the room, and remind everyone that not every moment of this has to feel like survival. Whole kernels are small, lightweight, and inexpensive. They store well, they take up almost no space, and the return they offer, not in calories or nutrients, but in morale, makes them one of the most practical items on this entire list. So here is the shift that separates a pantry that looks full from a pantry that actually functions. Stop thinking about shelf life, start thinking about real life.
A bag of dry beans has a 10-year shelf life, but it cannot feed your family on night one of a crisis. A can of sardines lasts 3 years, but it can transform a plain bowl of rice into a satisfying, nourishing meal in under 5 minutes. A bottle of apple cider vinegar costs almost nothing, but it can be the difference between a family that keeps eating and a family that quietly starts to give up on the food you've worked hard to prepare. The 12 items we covered today, canned beans, canned fish in oil, whole milk powder, red lentils, rolled oats, peanut butter, bouillon, apple cider vinegar, dried mushrooms, baking soda, and whole popcorn kernels, are not replacements for your rice and your pasta and your long-term dry goods. They are the layer that makes everything else work. They fill the gaps in fat, in flavor, in speed, and in the kind of quiet, everyday comfort that keeps a household functioning when things get hard. That's what a smart pantry actually looks like. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. Subscribe to Food Decider if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next one.